Today's topic, which is functional toxicology, is certainly not one that was covered in my pre or postgraduate medical training, and one that I think physicians are by and large not generally exposed to or broadly schooled on. Environmental pollution is increasing worldwide. There's compelling evidence that various pollutants, toxins, toxicants, chemical agents have the potential to have carcinogenic, epigenetic, endocrine-disrupting, and immune-altering action, and therefore disrupt reproductive, developmental, systemic, and neurological health, and contribute to many chronic diseases typically seen in routine practice. I know in my field of neurology, airborne pollutants and fine particulates are risk factors for dementia, for stroke, for Parkinson's disease, just to name a few. And despite escalating public health measures to create pollutant environment friendly environments and sustainable remediation technologies, many people throughout the world have already accrued a significant burden of toxicants, placing them at potential health risks. As a result, there's increasing discussion underway about possible interventions to facilitate elimination of persistent toxicants in order to obviate, detrimental effects on health and potentially ameliorate chronic degenerative diseases. So today we're very pleased and privileged to be joined by Dr. Rountree, who is a fellow on our Academy of Science and Medicine. He's passionate about the outdoors and about conservation and preservation of the environment. And he's been practicing family medicine in Boulder, Colorado since 1983. The past 2 decades, he's had the opportunity to lecture around the world to professional and public audiences. So Bob, it's a pleasure to have you here today. Thank you so much for making the time, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thanks, David. I think you've actually summarized the whole talk in 5 minutes, but I'll do my best to flesh it out, and I'll also do my best not to scare the pants off of you, because some of this information that I'm about to present is it's fairly disturbing, I should say. I've spent a good part of the last 25 years really delving into the research on environmental toxicants and what their potential health impacts could be, which I've titled Toxicology in Small Doses, the effect of daily exposure to small doses of things that don't kill us or poison us acutely, at least overtly, but could be having long-term effects on our health. So that's what this talk is really about. And I will do my best to leave you with some uplifting information at the end. So it's not all Dr. Doom, all gloom. There are some aspects of hope at the end for what we can do about this particular situation. So the story really starts with Paracelsus. That was his stage name, his academic name, as you were, and he's considered to be the father of the science of toxicology. And understand that in Paracelsus' day, in the 1500s, the prevailing thought was that illness was a result of imbalances of the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow, and black bile. And everything we did to treat what appeared to be a health problem had to do with restoring balance in those internal humors. And one of the main treatments was mercury. In fact, Paracelsus himself prescribed mercury. And as a keen observer, he noted that the impact of mercury had a lot to do with the dose. If you got above a certain dose, then you may see benefits, but you could also see toxic effects. So that is really what originated the idea of the toxic threshold, that there was a threshold below which toxic effects would not be observed. And from that comes this famous quote from Paracelsus that's still used today. What is there that is not poison? Everything's a poison, and nothing is without poison. So whether you're talking about mercury or water, too much of anything can be poisonous. But then he comes to the conclusion that only the dose, solely the dose, determines that a thing is not a poison. Now, we have been focused on that concept of a threshold phenomenon, or what is now termed the no observed adverse effect level. We've been focused on that for 600 years. And we really seem to have a hard time getting away from that in conventional toxicology. And that's where the distinction comes in when we talk about functional toxicology or environmental toxicology. Back then, Paracelsus was dealing with known compounds like mercury. But now we have lots of unknown compounds that are being introduced into the environment. And when you look at this picture, you have to consider all the ramifications. Where is all that stuff being sprayed ending up? 90-some% of it is not actually ending up in the field. It's ending up in the air where it drifts to surrounding farms, to schools, to suburbs, etc. So the stuff coming out of that plane is affecting all of us. And the pesticides, the herbicides that are ending up in the plants are staying in those plants, and then we end up consuming them. So it creates a bit of a vicious cycle. And that's what led Dr. Philip Grandjean, who's at Harvard School of Public Health, to say we need to revisit Paracelsus. And we need to rethink the idea of the dose concept, because now we're in a complex world where there is this huge amount of industrial chemicals, many of which have not been tested. We don't have documentation about the potential toxic effect and the level at which they can exert their toxicity in the body. Now, he's also an editor of one of the toxicology journals, I think it's called Environmental Health. And in looking at the kind of publications that are being cranked out over and over again, the focus has been on toxic metals. We're still writing articles on mercury 600 years later, trying to figure out, is mercury toxic at what level? Who is it toxic to? But that's not where the focus should be, according to Dr. Grandjean. The focus should be on these less well-known hazards. And yet we're simply not paying very much attention to them. But we need to be, because that is a public health crisis that we're currently addressing. So here's really the frame for what I want to talk about, the core premises. Number one is that exposure to low doses of pollutants, pesticides, and other environmental toxicants is widespread. It's all over the planet. It's increasing, and it's lifelong. It begins in utero. The combined body burdens, which have been referred to as the total toxic load of these toxicants, can interact in very unpredictable ways. In some scenarios, it's not a problem, but in other situations, and there are ample opportunities for this, these interactions can either activate physiologic dysfunction or can amplify physiologic dysfunction. In susceptible individuals, that dysfunction can lead to an acute disease, which is less common, and more commonly, a chronic illness, such as the many problems we have in our society, everywhere from neurodegenerative diseases to metabolic diseases, you name it. Every one of those chronic diseases has lurking in the background the potential to be exacerbated by exposure to a mixture of toxicants. So what determines susceptibility? Well, it's multifactorial. It's somewhat genetic, but lifestyle plays a huge role. Changes in life, especially childbirth, puberty, any change in life. Then there's socioeconomic factors. And then last but not least, the emerging science of the exposome, which is telling us a lot of things that we never expected about how huge our overall exposure is. And then finally, and most importantly, the notion that changes in our lifestyle, living differently, not huge changes, but minor changes in lifestyle and our diet and our overall nutrition can reduce this susceptibility. So I'm going to touch on all of these points today. Obviously, if we go into detail in any one of them, it could go on for hours on end. So what I want to do is just give you an overview of the current thinking and what's out there in the literature. So the story of what's happening in modern society really has a lot to do with mosquitoes. Humans have basically interacted with mosquitoes for a very long time, for hundreds of thousands of years. And I understand it. I get why we don't like bugs, and I get why we don't like weeds. I mean, this is really our whole problem. We don't like bugs and we don't like weeds. So we want to kill them. We want to get rid of them. Malaria has killed probably more human beings than any other infectious disease in history. It's a terrible disease. People still die from it. I've had malaria when I was in Africa. It was not fun. I get it. You don't want to get malaria. I've seen little kids seizing from malaria in the hospital. It's a horrible thing to witness. So I understand why anything that might help prevent it is going to be considered a major advance in science. So that's why Dr. Paul Mueller won the Nobel Prize in 1948. He found this chemical on the shelf, DDT, and he discovered that it was a very effective insecticide. And he got the Nobel Prize. So this is great. We've got this substance that appears to be non-toxic. Let's spray it everywhere. And I know people who, when they were kids, actually got fogged with DDT. They remember being on picnics, sitting at a picnic table, and a truck would come by and mist the whole area because DDT was considered so safe. People didn't get sick from it acutely, and there was no problem. Well, the problem turns out that, like a lot of organochlorines, it gets absorbed into the body and stored in body fat. And it can stay in body fat for a lifetime and can have epigenetic effects that are transgenerational. So this is a typical ad for the time. DDT is good for me. Everyone thought this is the most wonderful thing that's out there. But then here comes a biologist, a marine biologist, who's studying raptors and noticed that bald eagles were in decline. And the reason they were in decline is because their eggshells were thinning. So the bald eagle populations, our American bird, was dropping dramatically. She started studying that, and then she began to realize, well, this is just the tip of the iceberg, this effect of DDT. And from that comes a quote that is quite famous that I've read myself thousands of times, really. For the first time in history, every human being is subjected to contact with dangerous chemicals from the moment of conception until death. In less than 2 decades of use, synthetic pesticides are so thoroughly distributed throughout the animate and inanimate world, they occur virtually everywhere. And here's the rub. Rachel Carson wrote this in 1962, 60 years ago. And since then, this issue has only gotten worse. Now, a few things to know about Rachel Carson. She was getting RT for breast cancer when she wrote this book and subsequently died from breast cancer. And she tried to keep that fact hidden when she was testifying before Congress. The other thing to know is that there was a lot of money behind DDT. So when Rachel Carson started quietly presenting the facts about how DDT and organochlorines may be impacting our health, you can believe there was a huge advertising campaign to say this woman is a quack. This is schlock science. There's nothing to it. But what has happened since Rachel Carson's day? A lot of things are changing in our environment. We are seeing major impact of endocrine disruption. And we still don't have the answer for what's going on. But here is a Time magazine cover from the year 2000, 20-some years ago, talking about how little girls are getting breast buds at an earlier age, their periods are starting at an earlier age, and we don't know what's happening. What is going on? It certainly seems reasonable to assume that something in our environment is changing the signaling of the reproductive organs. So this doesn't prove anything, but this is a study that was published by the Harvard School of Public Health back in 2005 that found a correlation. And I want to be really clear on that term. Correlation is not causation. I'm fully aware of that. But nevertheless, here's this correlation that higher levels of serum DDT were associated with earlier age at menarche and an increased risk of experiencing a shortened menstrual cycle. Okay, if that was the only paper that ever showed this, it would not be nearly enough. But even in the background of the abstract, it stated that DDT exposure is known to affect human endocrine function. Back in 2005. Well, we've gone much further since then. Now it turns out that DDT induces epigenetic changes. And these epigenetic changes are transgenerational. They're transgenerational, and they've been shown to affect genes involved in weight management, obesity, renal function, testicular function, ovarian disease. So this is getting to be a big thing. Now you may say, well, wait a minute, wasn't DDT banned in the US in 1972? Yes, but there is still a big controversy. There's still people pushing back saying, oh, all those crazy environmentalists, they really exaggerated the facts, and maybe DDT isn't so bad. We should bring it back. And it is still being used all over the world outside of most developed countries. In India, 5,000 metric tons per year are being used of DDT. So it's not gone away. And those kids that were sprayed during their early years, especially if it was during puberty, still have the remnants of the DDT, the breakdown products, especially DDE, in their body fat. The authors of this particular paper make the argument that maybe the benefits that we get from preventing malaria now are not worth it when you look at the transgenerational effects. So if we have a gestating female that's exposed to DDT, it's not just one generation that's impacted. It's 2 and 3 generations that could be impacted in a number of different ways, transgenerational inheritance. So this is a huge impact, and it's totally unexpected. So this is a fairly typical thing. Many of you know of the work of Philip Landrigan, who used to be at Mount Sinai Medical School. He's now at Boston College. And Dr. Landrigan's work had a lot to do with us beginning to appreciate how toxic lead was. At the time he began his research, it was thought that you had to have a fairly high level of lead to experience neurotoxicity. And his work, along with Herbert Needleman, who was a psychiatrist in Pittsburgh, established that you could get neurotoxic effects from lead at much, much lower levels. And of course, when Landrigan and Needleman came out with this research, they were lambasted by the industry. They were lambasted. They were told, you're quacks. There's no research behind this. And of course, no one would dispute that now. So that led Landrigan to looking at other substances in our environment that could be similarly problematic. And so here's a quote that summarizes that. What typically happens is a smart chemist develops a new product. It sees that it's useful, puts it in consumer goods, and then suddenly the chemical is everywhere. However, 10, 15, 20 years later, we began to realize this chemical is really quite toxic. And I'm going to give you several examples of exactly what he's talking about. But one of the most disturbing ones is something called diethylstilbestrol. Remember that? DES. And look at this ad. This is from the 1950s. Should you really take it? Yes. Why? To prevent abortion, miscarriage, and premature labor. And then look at the subtext. Recommended for routine prophylaxis in all pregnancies. In all pregnancies. And there's no side effects. Isn't that wonderful? So what is DES? Well, it's a hormone. It's synthesized from coal tar. It was synthesized back in 1938. And between 1940 and 1970, for 30 years, it was given initially to prevent premature birth, but later it was given as supportive therapy to all pregnant women, heavily promoted to all pregnant women. It was also given to teenagers to prevent acne. So by the time it went off the market, 10 million American women had either gotten DES during their pregnancy or they were exposed to it in utero and were affected by it. They got anatomic abnormalities or, in some cases, cancer. I actually treated a woman who had vaginal cancer who had gotten it from her mother who had been treated with DES. So this is a real thing. It's still out there. There's still women who can't get pregnant because they have bicornate uteruses. And we don't know what the other impact was from all the DES that was put into animal feed, 13 tons. The number boggles the mind, 13 tons per year. Here's the rub. I told you that it was given, prescribed until 1970, but an article in the American Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology published in 1953 showed it was ineffective for preventing miscarriages. So it continued to be prescribed for another 20 years. And it wasn't until 71 when the famous article came out in the New England Journal showing this increased incidence of vaginal carcinoma associated with it, when people finally said, oh boy, we better back off. Later, it was linked to all kinds of cancers. It was linked to congenital deformities of the uterus and other reproductive organs. So we gave this stuff for decades. We gave it for decades with very little evidence regarding its safety or efficacy. And then, unfortunately, it was found that just like DDT, it had transgenerational epigenetic effects. And you would think this is something that we would be studying extensively because of so much exposure that occurred. And yet, as Dr. Grandjean pointed out, we're still focusing on these toxic metals. Yeah, the toxic metals are a problem, but this is also a widespread problem in our society. We need to collect more information on it. The point of bringing up DES is that this was when we began to realize that there are compounds that could disrupt the endocrine system, what's now referred to as EDCs, or endocrine-disrupting compounds. So if you see estradiol on the right and DDT on the left, I can imagine a chemist would say, they're nothing like each other, right? They've got some benzene rings, there's some gross similarities perhaps, but who would think that the DDT is going to bind to the ER, the estrogen receptor? Well, it doesn't bind all the time, but if you're exposing the person to DDT for years on end, at some point, the reproductive cells are going to make a mistake. At some point, that DDT is going to fit in the pocket of the estrogen receptor and is going to set off a signaling chain reaction that's going to produce an unwanted effect. So it's these tiny little mistakes made by very small amounts of chemicals that are problematic. Now, this led a group of scientists to get together and come up with a consensus. It was sponsored by the World Health Organization. This was published in 2012. And you wouldn't believe the kind of pushback that they got. This is a very conservative scientific document that simply reviewed the evidence. And of course, industry did not like this. So there was a host of articles and rebuttals that came out and said, this is not good science, et cetera. And I think it was a bit of a shock to the researchers that put this together, because they simply said, we're collecting this data. What did they say in this particular monograph? A lot of endocrine-related disorders are on the rise, and I'll show you what some of those are later. The speed at which this is occurring outpaces the idea that this could be genetic. It's something environmental. We've got a number of laboratory studies that show how this could work, how these chemicals can interact with the receptors and other signaling pathways. And the most sensitive window is during fetal development and puberty. So whenever the body's going through changes, that's when we're most susceptible. The problem is it's not just the reproductive system. It's any hormonal system in the body. It's the pancreas. It's the adrenal glands. It's the thyroid gland. So all of these hormonal systems can be impacted in the same way. So when we're talking about endocrine disruptors, you may have thought, oh yeah, we're talking about reproductive issues. No, it's much, much bigger than that. So we need to pay attention to our exposures. Bottom line, we need to figure out where these things are coming from and try to avoid them as much as possible. So here is a list of some of the concerns that have been documented in the last few years. Hypospadias, congenital deformity, increasing. Testicular cancer, increasing. Sperm count, dropping to the point that at some point you have to wonder, are we going to have mass problems with infertility? Cryptorchidism, increasing. Prostate cancer, increasing. Breast cancer, increasing. And earlier puberty, as I mentioned. If you look at the left, a lot of different ways that these EDCs can be causing this. Direct effects, epigenetic effects, problems with signal transduction, interfering with hormone synthesis. So a myriad of different pathways that could be explaining what's going on. So that has led a number of researchers to say we really need to rethink the standard axioms of toxicology. Those two axioms being, number one, that every chemical has a threshold below which there's no adverse effect. So where is that threshold? How do we define that threshold? And number two, the notion that the dose makes the poison needs to be evaluated. So this may seem obvious to some of you, but I can tell you this is a huge debate that's going on in the toxicology and endocrinology literature. By and large, the mainstream toxicologists keep clinging on to these old axioms and saying, no, this has served us well. It's all very true. There's no question about it. The endocrinologists, on the other hand, are pushing back in a major way. And why is it that the endocrinologists are the ones that are pushing back? Because endocrinologists know that when you're measuring estrogen levels, you're measuring nanomolar to micromolar ranges. So they know that the body is used to doses that the toxicologists would call a low dose. What's a low dose to an endocrinologist? It's a very different concept than what a toxicologist would consider a low dose. So that's why we see papers like this one that say the term low dose may be a misnomer. You know, I measure 17 beta estradiol levels all the time, every day, and testosterone levels every day. It's a number on a page. I see a woman with an estrogen level of 40 picograms per ml. Oh, she's 40. Well, she's in the range. You know, I want to know, is it follicular stage, is she menopausal? Where does she fall on that range? But it's just a number on the page. But I want you to think about what that number means. 35 picograms per ml. A picogram is 1 trillionth of a gram. 1 part per million, which is more than that, is 1 mouthful of food in a lifetime of eating. 1 part per billion is 1 drop of water in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. So again, we look at these numbers on the page and they're just numbered. You're high, you're low, etc. The body has this extraordinary ability to detect very, very tiny changes in what a toxicologist would call a low dose. A low dose. So I think that's why we're seeing this fight between the toxicologists, and I have to say it, but many of the toxicology journals are sponsored by the companies that are making the chemicals, right? So they have a vested interest in saying these chemicals are fine, they're not a problem. But the endocrinologists, on the other hand, they're the ones that are pushing back. So with that in mind, let's talk about something I'm sure you've all heard about, which is bisphenol-A. Bisphenol-A was synthesized in 1891. It sat on the shelf for decades. But then in the 30s, it was discovered that it had estrogenic properties, and it was considered as a potential new drug. In fact, I think for a while it was actually licensed as a drug. And the only reason it didn't come into widespread use was because DES was discovered to have similar effects, but was a little bit more potent. So DES took over for bisphenol-A. That's the history of this compound. But it didn't get completely discarded because in 1957, it was discovered that when you polymerize bisphenol-A, it makes this nice enamel-like material that is seemingly very hard and seemingly very inert. Oh, well, that's great stuff. Let's put it in everything. 8 billion pounds a year. 8 billion pounds a year. Think about how much that is in our environment. Well, where is it? It's in polycarbonate. So polycarbonate drinking water bottles, in baby bottles. So baby formula is going into bottles lined with bisphenol-A. It lines 80% of the cans made in the US for food and juice, etc. Do you think that it ever leaches into the juice or into the fruit? You bet it does. There's no question about it. It's also used in dental sealants. Even if a little bit of that leaches, it's enough to get it into our bloodstreams. And a big concern that's been raised more recently is these shiny thermal paper receipts that are everywhere. Most places now use thermal printers for making their receipts. And it turns out that shiny coating has got bisphenol-A in it. So when you touch those receipts, especially if you're doing it all day long because you're a cashier, then I guarantee you your bisphenol-A levels are going up. So the problem is it's not inert, it leaches. It leaches. Now, Dr. Vom Saal, who's done a lot of this research, found that when you put on hand sanitizer and then touch the receipt, the hand sanitizer enhances absorption. So what if you go down to McDonald's? I don't want to just single out McDonald's. Go to Burger King, any fast food place, and order some fries and a burger. They hand you the receipt. You touch the receipt. Oh, you didn't want to get contaminated because you're worried about COVID. So you squirt on a little hand sanitizer. You get the receipt, grab your French fries, and put the French fries in your mouth. Well, all that goes together to increase the bisphenol-A in your systemic circulation. And this is a problem because now it turns out 90% of people in the US have measurable amounts of bisphenol-A. And some governments have said this is a problem. In Canada, they declared it a toxic substance in 2010. it's still allowed here. Well, if you look at the data on it, it's very clear that it's an endocrine disruptor. And who's most susceptible? Children. And higher levels, again, association, not causation. But still, how many of these associations do you need before you start saying, well, all of this adds up? So we have associations with cardiovascular disease, with diabetes, with NASH, or what some people are calling TASH, toxicant-associated steatohepatitis. And additionally, links to cancer, thyroid disorders, obesity, infertility, all of which are on the rise in our society. This is just one paper, and there's actually quite a few of these, but this was published in JAMA back in 2012, where they measured urinary bisphenol-A, and higher levels were significantly associated with obesity in children and adolescents. Another study I'm aware of was in workers in China in a plant that was making bisphenol-A, where there was a significantly higher incidence of infertility. So as Landrigan said, here's this chemical, looked really great. It seemed non-toxic. You could handle it. You could touch it. You could eat it. It didn't make people sick. But it was only after long-term exposure for years on end that we began to see diseases emerging as a consequence. Another subject that's in the news a lot lately, and this one may hit even closer to home, is a group of chemicals that all are polyfluorinated perfluorochemicals. So the first round of them were called PFCs. Now they're called PFAS, polyfluorinated compounds. And I have to say, I was a poster child for these chemicals when they came out. Living in Colorado, we love Gore-Tex, right? We got Gore-Tex everything, Gore-Tex rain suits, Gore-Tex underwear, Gore-Tex ties, amazing stuff. Scotch Guard, you know, keeps you from getting stain on your sofa, so you spray it on everything, spray Stain Master on your carpet, use Teflon cookware. So yeah, I was the poster child for that. And what about Gore-Tex grafts? Vascular grafts seem to be a great material for grafts. Does it leach? Well, do we have the studies? Do we know? It's a pretty good assumption that they do leach. And the problem with these chemicals, they don't store in body fat, but they're so ubiquitous that they stay in circulation forever, and they're going to stay in the environment forever. If we stop making these chemicals now, they're going to stay in the environment forever, forever. So what does that have to do with today? Well, the earlier compounds were very long chain compounds. Now they're using shorter chain compounds that were supposed to be safer, but research is really challenging that. So I saw this fun little headline over a month ago: Boston bans AstroTurf due to toxic forever chemicals. And I'd scratch my head and thought, wait a minute, isn't artificial turf a great thing, right? It doesn't use water. I have friends that are putting artificial turf in their backyards because it's so much easier to deal with. But we've got this in parks. We've got our professional ball players playing on this stuff. And now there's research suggesting that they're leaching chemicals, right? So if you just look at this, well, there's this nice clean surface. How could that possibly be a problem? But of course, you're kicking it around. And what happens in high heat situations? What happens when it's wet? You've got ball players that are rolling all over this stuff. Do you think there's an opportunity to get exposed to PFAS? Absolutely. And some of this research is actually coming out of UMass in Lowell that's raising all kinds of concerns about artificial turf. It can outgas. It's made of tire crumb materials that are hazardous to the environment. Those grass fibers can leach out the PFAS. And then where do they go when the fields have outlived their usefulness? What do we do with them? What do we do with them? That's a problem. And then last but not least, there's microplastics that are coming from them. So this is, I have to say, I was kind of shocked when I ran into this because it's just one more thing that, doesn't seem like a problem, seems like a good thing. And then you start diving down the rabbit hole and begin to realize, well, this has huge implications. So what are these compounds called forever chemicals? They're per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. And they started making them, over 65 years ago. And now they're all over the planet. You can't go anywhere in the planet without finding traces of them, including rainwater. So it's in the atmosphere and falling down on us. How much of these chemicals are we making? Or more than a megaton per year. What's a megaton? That's 1 million tons. 1 million tons a year are being released into our environment. Well, you might say, of course, they've been researched. The government wouldn't allow them to release a megaton into the environment without making sure that they're safe. Well, actually, in vitro studies, animal studies are saying, yeah, they're endocrine disruptors. They have a wide range of toxic effects, not acutely toxic, chronic toxicity from low dose exposure. So where are we finding these chemicals? Firefighting foam, cleaning supplies, nonstick cookware. And by the way, when DuPont came out with Teflon, at first they said, oh, this is so inert, you never have to worry about it. Then a few years later, they said, well, don't let your pet bird be in the kitchen when you're cooking, because when you hit a certain temperature with the Teflon, it aerosolizes some of these compounds and it will kill your bird. So there was a lot of jokes about don't bring your budgie into the kitchen because it might be harmful to your budgie, but it's okay for you. Even water supplies have these chemicals. Clothing, shoes, furniture, fish, food containers are lined with them. So we're all being exposed to these things. And that's why one of the latest National Health and Nutrition surveys showed that all Americans have detectable PFAS concentrations in their serum. We all have this in our serum. Well, who cares? It's a low dose. It's a low dose. Who cares? Well, here's a study out of NYU that was just published this year. And this study specifically looked at a new short chain PFA. So the presumption was the newer ones are shorter chain, so they're less toxic. And they disproved that. The serum concentrations of PFH-PA, which is a short chain PFA, was associated with impaired vascular function. And this is in people that didn't have overt sign of heart disease. So this is the early stages of cardiovascular disease. So it turns out that PFAS basically are vasculotoxic compounds. They damage endothelium. And we all know that endothelial damage is really the first stage in atherosclerotic disease. This is where it all begins in young, healthy people who have only this exposure. Now, who might this apply to? How about professional athletes, right? We don't really have any answers on that. Are we measuring this in professional athletes? Should we be? Well, I think we need to be doing those studies to see if there is an impact of playing on this artificial turf day in and day out, right? So I've talked about Bisphenol-A, I've talked about DDT, I've talked about DES, and I wish I could say, well, that's the end of the story, but obviously we live in a chemical-rich society, right? That's really just the beginning of what we're exposed to. The term that's being used to describe all of these things together is the body burden. And there's different ways that you can use that term. You can talk about the body burden of mercury or the body burden of organochlorines, the body burden of organophosphates. but when you put them all together, they're referred to as the chemical body burden. And these are the chemicals that basically build up in our system at varying rates from one individual to another. So that introduces this concept of a total toxic load. You don't see that so much in the literature as you do the body burden or the toxicant body burden. So that's a more common term. But really what we're talking about is the total load of toxins. And that will come into play in a few minutes when I talk about the exposome. So the question is, what are we being exposed to? Well, a wide range of environmental and industrial chemicals. I have to say, when I put all this together, I found it to be alarmingly alliterative because there are so many of these things that start with a P: pesticides, plasticizers, perfluoroalkyl substances, pigments, preservatives, pollutants, polybrominated biphenyls, petrochemicals, pharmaceuticals. It kind of boggles the mind how many different categories there are. And the reason that I wanted to show it to you like this as an overview is because many of the debates zero in on one thing. Is atrazine toxic? Is DDT toxic? Is bisphenol-A toxic? But that's taking it out of context. The context is that we are all being exposed to all the chemicals on this list all the time. And, you know, I put pharmaceuticals down at the bottom. In the textbooks, there's a distinction between xenobiotics, which are chemical compounds foreign to living organisms. There's a separate section for pharmaceuticals. Do you think the body makes a distinction? Do you think the body says, oh, well, that's a drug, that's okay, right? But this is a synthetic chemical. I'm putting that in a different category. So it's categorized differently in the text, but it's all part of the mix. And if a person is taking multiple pharmaceuticals, you bet that's going to influence their overall susceptibility. When we're looking at the potential human chemical burden, let me give you a perspective. There are over 85,000 chemicals registered with the US EPA. There are 40,000 different formulations of pesticides. 5,000 chemicals approved for use as inert ingredients. And putting all these together over a lifetime of exposure, that's what the issue is. If we're going to characterize this, there's only one way to do that. That's with AI, because this is clearly big data, right? And if we're not applying big data to understand this possibility that a person could be exposed to 1 million different chemicals in the course of a lifetime. So what I'm telling you is that the debates that focus on a single chemical, assuming a linear dose response curve, are missing the boat in a major way. And just to drive the point home about who's being affected, this is a paper that was published a number of years ago, Hazardous Chemicals in Healthcare, that was a snapshot of chemicals in doctors and nurses. So they tested docs and nurses from 10 different states from several different chemical groups, including bisphenol-A, mercury, the perfluorinated compounds, phthalates, flame retardants, and triclosan, which is a disinfectant, you know, that we put in antibacterial soaps and a number of other compounds. So every participant they tested had some toxic chemical. Everyone had at least 24 chemicals present, and 4 of them are on a priority list from the EPA for regulation. So healthcare turns out to be a high-risk situation for exposure to a lot of these potentially toxic compounds. And this is what led Stephen Genowes, who's written a lot on this, is at the University of Alberta, to say there's compelling evidence we live in an era of toxicity and that our environmental regulations are really not making it. They've fallen short. As a result, we're the first generation of humankind to be affronted by exposure to a wide range of unsafe toxicants that can bioaccumulate. So this is an update of what Rachel Carson said back in 1962, that this is a huge issue. We're all exposed. Clearly, there's certain subsets of the population that have more exposure than others. And what are the consequences of this? We know that a number of children's health harms are on the rise. Now, I showed you the increase in endocrine-related disorders, reproductive system-related disorders. What about neuropsychiatric disorders? Autism appears to be going up. I know that's debatable. Are we better at detection, or are the rates of autism actually going up? There's people on both sides of the fence, but I think it does appear to be increasing. ADD clearly going up, developmental disabilities going up, childhood cancers going up, diabetes going up, obesity going up. So it's not just one isolated problem. And when you map that, all those disorders that are increasing against what's being released in our environment, herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, fumigants, then you see a lot of cross-checking going on. Again, I will be perfectly honest, this doesn't prove anything, right? But it raises concerns. It raises concerns that something is going on here, and we can't just say it's genetic. We don't have more bad genes that are causing this problem. There's something in our environment that is causing these issues, and children are really the ones that are most susceptible to it. Now, I would love it if the American Academy of Pediatrics would come out and make a position statement on this. ACOG has, and I'll show you that statement later. But I think it's time for AAP and some of those organizations to step forward and say, we need to focus on this. We need to do research on this to figure out what's going on. One way to focus on this is this emerging field of exposome science. So what's the exposome? It's everything beyond the genome, right? Anything that can influence your phenotype. And there is really a huge emerging literature on this. Many of you know the Mayo Clinic just sponsored a 2-day symposium on the exposome just last month. So we're finally finding that this is being taken serious. So the exposome includes the internal environment, what's going on in the gut, right? That's huge. What's the level of oxidative stress going on? What about xenobiotics in circulation? So that's the internal environment. Then you have to mix that with the person's stress level. We know that stress can raise inflammatory cytokines, and that can have a host of effects on the body. How is that person living? What's their alcohol intake like? What about other recreational drugs? What about air pollution? What about exposure to fires? What about infections, medications? All of that stuff goes into the mix. So again, we've got to get away from this focus on a single chemical or even a group of chemicals and say, how are all these things interacting together? This is an overview of where the research is going. We start with the lifetime exposure, this mix, this soup, and then we filter it through all the different omics, right? Starting with the genome, the epigenome, the transcriptome, the proteome, and ultimately the metabolome. And there's a lot of research going on right now in metabolomics, looking for molecular signatures that would be a biomarker of effect from exposure to mixtures of these toxicants. So finally, we end up with the phenotype. This is the kind of research that we need to be doing to figure out what the future holds for us. And some of the best research is coming out of Stanford. Many of you know of Michael Snyder's work. A more recent study that they published used what they called an exposometer, an exposometer that people wore day in, day out, that picked up on all kinds of biological and chemical exposures over a very long period of time, a couple of years, in 66 different locations. And what they found is that there's potential exposure to huge numbers of microbes that we never expected. in addition to huge numbers of chemical compounds, insecticides, carcinogens, etc. So this really doesn't leave any doubt that these exposures are going on a widespread level throughout the population. And what Snyder's group calls this is the human exposome cloud, right? And we're going to have to use cloud data servers to be able to compute exactly what all this means, because, you know, the finding is that the exposome is vast, much bigger than we ever would have imagined. And the other thing that's really weird is that you're going to have two people who are living in the same home, working in the same office, that have different exposomes. So first of all, we can't just go by exposure itself. We also have to look at how much of these compounds are actually reaching the target organ, right? And that is going to vary from individual to individual. So that leads me to an equation that I talk with patients about all the time. And so this is a much bigger scenario than what Paracelsus talked about. What is an individual's disease risk from one or more exposures? In the beginning, there was only one thing that mattered, and that was the potency of the compound, right? If you get enough mercury in your system, you're going to have toxic effects. I don't care about your susceptibility or how much is accumulate. Enough mercury will kill you. Enough dioxin will kill you if you get exposed to a significant enough amount. So the more toxic the compound is, the less everything else matters. But what about a substance like DDT that you can spray people with and they don't seem to have any ill effects whatsoever? They don't even cough. They feel fine. So it seems to have low toxic potency. But what if you're exposed to that every day? What if you have a cumulative exposure? That could make a huge difference in anybody, no matter their susceptibility. If their total toxic load reaches a certain level, eventually it's going to spill over and affect physiology. And then finally, you have the individual susceptibility. Truthfully, there's some people that are so susceptible that even tiny amounts of these substances can cause a problem. That's the person that can have a sip of green tea in the morning and they can't sleep for 3 days, right? Because they just don't metabolize caffeine. And you can apply that same susceptibility to any compound you can name. So this takes us full circle from Paracelsus' concept that the lower the dose, the less likely you are to have toxicity, to Stephen Gilbert's perspective, which was in his book, A Small Dose of Toxicology, that I highly recommend that you all get. You can download it for free. It's really a terrific, well thought out, reasonable book. And basically what Dr. Gilbert says is the sensitivity of an individual differentiates a poison from a remedy. It's the person we should be focusing on, because the fundamental principle of toxicology is the individual response to a dose. That's a whole different world than blaming the chemical. Instead, we're saying, what about the person? What about their own unique circumstances that are going to influence whether they react or not? So if you're measuring mercury levels, you can look at what the lab says is a normal range for mercury, but then you have to ask, what's a healthy, safe range for that individual, depending on their context and their overall exposome, other things they're exposed to, their overall health. So here we have a spectrum of vulnerability, and this is the kind of chart that regulatory agencies would look at. We want to know how much arsenic is acceptable in a water supply. So let's find the average threshold at which some people are going to be affected by arsenic and some aren't. And then let's cut that down by a 2 sigma variation. We're going to get 97+% of people that are not going to react. So we'll permit this level of arsenic exposure in the water supply. But even when you do that, you've got individuals on the far left that are going to be harmed. And you have to ask the question, well, who are those individuals? I will submit to you, a big chunk of them are children, right? Or gestating females that are in a very vulnerable point in their life. So regulatory agencies are not taking that into consideration. And they're also not taking into consideration the exposome and how you put all this information together. So here's a kind of a short list. It really is just an overview. We could go on for a long time about it, but why are some individuals more sensitive? It's partially because they have increased or ongoing exposure. And from that, we can say there's certain groups you can identify right off that have a problem. What about firefighters? Right? So firefighters exposed to foam and burning toxic materials, et cetera. A lot of work was done in the first responders to 9/11, right? And the kind of long-term health impacts they had from that mix of toxic chemicals from the burning buildings, right? And research is actively ongoing about that, although it has been hard to prove. We need to do more of that kind of research. So that exposure level makes a person more sensitive. Eating a poor diet with a lot of refined food and missing the most basic nutrients. Some people don't even get the most basic amounts of B vitamins, antioxidants, etc. What about allostatic load? If a person's under a high level stress for a long period of time, they'll maladapt to that. And that maladaptive state actually is a setup for them to be triggered by what may seem to be an innocuous amount of a particular toxin. So we have to consider that. And what are the causes of stress? Living environment can have a lot to do with that. Do they have a safe environment? Right? Do they experience discrimination in their work or in their home, their living environment? All those things play a role. Intestinal dysbiosis, overgrowth of unhealthy bacterial. And then last but not least, genetic variants, single nucleotide polymorphisms in the phase 1 and phase 2 biotransformation enzymes that are primarily involved in transforming lipophilic toxicants that would normally stay in body fat, but need to be transformed so they can get excreted in bile or in urine. And there's a lot of these variants that can make a huge role in susceptibility. And that whole area is called toxicogenomics, right? A subject for another day's discussion because we could spend a few hours on that one. Bottom line is, back to Stephen Genois, the contention that the body has an inherent ability to eliminate quickly all adverse chemical compounds is inaccurate. And this is really a response to what I see in some of the mainstream texts, that if you want to detoxify or lower the total toxic load, all you have to do is drink a lot of water. Drink a lot of water, you'll pee all these compounds out and they won't cause a problem. Well, it's simply not true. Many toxicants have long half-lives. They end up in adipose tissue. They can end up in the brain. They can end up in bone, just like lead can end up in bone, and they can maintain a long-term potential to inflict damage. So we really need to look at what's happening in the long run. The bottom line is that we are increasingly being exposed to new compounds that are being released into the environment all the time. And in Europe, the attitude towards this is to say, we've got to stop releasing these new chemicals until we have proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that they're safe. And that's called the precautionary principle. And the idea behind the precautionary principle is that the manufacturer of the chemical is the one that bears the burden of responsibility for proving it's safe. Why is this a big deal? Because once something gets in the environment, like these PFAS forever chemicals, it is very difficult to take them off the market by proving that they're toxic, right? Because the forces that are behind keeping them going are very strong and very, very difficult to challenge. So one of the first things that we need to do to deal with this situation is stop ongoing production and release of new chemicals without proof of safety. So this is the big debate, you know, the Scientists are saying, prove that it's safe. And industry is saying, prove that it's not safe. I advocate the precautionary principle. And that brings us to what I think is a very encouraging development. This is from the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecologists. This was published back in 2013, but actually was a revision of an earlier statement, reducing prenatal exposure to toxic environmental agents. I really applauded them for coming out with this. And there are a few key points in this paper that are worth talking about. It's important for OBs to be knowledgeable about toxic environmental agents and be able to do an environmental risk assessment so that you can reduce exposure and then you can counsel. So ACOG is really taking the lead on this. Well, OBs should be doing this. Shouldn't all of us be doing this? Family practitioners, pediatrician, sports medicine docs. I mean, you know, whatever your specialty is, this is relevant. And I love the final statement in the last bullet point. It may be beneficial to integrate environmental health into obstetrics and gynecology training and practice. Well, if it's going to happen there, shouldn't this be a central part of medical school training? Shouldn't we all be learning about this? I didn't learn about it. The only thing I knew about toxicology was acute poisoning. But all of this is new since I got out of medical school and residency. And it's becoming clear this is a public health crisis. All of our patients are dealing with this. And we need better training. We need better training programs. And it needs to be happening at the university level. So this is more of a plea than anything else. So here's a summary of some of the things that ACOG recommends for pregnant women. And you may say, well, if it's good enough for pregnant women, maybe it's good enough for me and my patients. Avoid synthetic pesticides and herbicides. Use non-toxic cleaning agents like vinegar and baking soda. If you must go to a dry cleaner and can't do the clothes yourself, use some of the environmental cleaners that don't employ toxic chemicals. If you're going to remodel your house, use non-toxic, non-volatile building materials. Use natural cosmetics, nail polish, fragrances. What I always tell my patients is, whatever you put on your skin, you're basically eating. So you have to ask yourself, if you're going to paint that on your nails, if you're going to put that on your face or your eyelids, would you eat it? Because you are eating it. It will end up in your bloodstream. Think about your indoor air. Get nice plants and air purifiers. If you have to use food wrap, then use the polyethylene, which is clear. It doesn't stick very well. That's the problem. Cling wrap sticks much better, but it's the cling that makes the chemicals that leach into the food. And for God's sake, don't put don't put plastics into a microwave, even if it says microwave safe. I don't trust it. Only glass. Use water bottles, preferably glass or BPA and BPS free, and canned food, especially for pregnant women, I think is a no-no. Don't overheat Teflon. It might kill your budgie. Not good for your bird, especially for pregnant women. Be careful about your fish consumption, especially large tuna. What about all that sushi, the yummy sushi? You know, where's that coming from? Obviously, avoid cigarette smoke, charred meat. Test your home for radon. We've done that here. Everybody in our neighborhood has got radon pumps because it's very ubiquitous here. Important point. You don't have to tell people you've always got to eat organic, right? It's better if you can, but the studies have shown that when you take kids and you switch them from eating packaged food to fresh food, that the organophosphates in their urine drop dramatically within 3 days, right? So that simple switch to fresh food, that's what makes the biggest difference. And the organic is kind of a fine tuning if it's possible. Flowers, think about where you get your flowers. I'm as concerned about the workers in Ecuador and other countries that are raising these flowers in environments where they're exposed to a lot of pesticides. So it's as much about how these flowers are produced as anything else. Try to drink purified or spring water, but then again, don't be buying all these plastic water bottles, which are filling up the ocean. Alcohol in moderation, that's pretty obvious. Acetaminophen is not the greatest thing for hangovers because it interferes with the glutathione detoxification pathway. And, a minimum number of drugs when possible. Are there any foods that are good? Living in Colorado, you feel really excited. If anything grows, you have to basically sit down and pray in front of your garden every day that your plants will stay alive. But a lot of research has been done on broccoli and broccoli sprouts. So we try to grow it if we can. Kale is also good, and that kind of represents a whole family of brassica vegetables that actually improve the ability to eliminate toxicants. Other foods, some people call these superfoods. I think that's kind of a magical thinking term, but I do think colorful foods that have a lot of pigments and antioxidants in them do seem to help neutralize free radicals. And so it's just generally a good idea to tell people, drink green tea, use garlic, rosemary, turmeric, a little bit of pomegranate juice, blueberries, raspberries, little purple grape juice, fermented foods when you can, yogurt, little kombucha, maybe some probiotics, and then especially the prebiotic fibers like flax and oats, chia seeds that help bond toxicants in the gut and get them out of circulation. One last thing to throw in. There is a global movement called healthcare without harm that's attempting to transform the healthcare sector. I talked to you about how physicians and nurses are really at a higher risk group for getting exposed to toxic chemicals. This is a group that is trying to do something about that. It's changing practices in hospitals in particular. So a group that's well worth knowing about. They're focusing on climate smart healthcare, on sustainable foods, and what are they serving in hospitals, whether hospitals are overusing mercury, are they creating toxic compounds, when they're burning their trash. So they're coming at it from many different angles. So a really good actionable step is to collaborate with that organization. And last but not least, some parting advice. This is from Cornelius Celsus. You might recognize Celsus is the guy that came up with the 4 cardinal signs of inflammation: rubor, tumor, dolor, and calor. This was his advice that he gave during the reign of Emperor Tiberius. He said, live in rooms full of light, avoid heavy food, be moderate in drinking of wine, take massage, baths, exercise, gymnastics, fight insomnia with gentle rocking or running water, change surroundings, take long journeys, indulge in cheerful conversation and amusements, listen to music, and most importantly, strictly avoid frightening ideas, which I think is important. I've told you a lot of things today that I think are scary, and the temptation is to just ignore all of it. Well, we can't do anything about it. It's overwhelming. When you talk to patients about it, they get overwhelmed, but we can't bury our heads in the sand, right? This is an ongoing problem. It's getting worse. We need to get better at assessing who's at risk. We need to get better at exposome science and figuring out how these substances interact. And we need to be taking the advice from ACOG and similar organizations and simply saying, okay, what are simple lifestyle measurements that we can take to try to lower our exposure to these toxins? And what are healthy foods that we can eat that will help our body get rid of them, right? Nothing fancy, just practical common sense, but things that need to be followed, right? And what makes it all work is to keep track of the literature so that we know what's out there that's potentially making us sick, so we can do something about it.
Well, Bob, I can't thank you enough. That was a powerful presentation. I have to say that looking at this Cornelius Celsus slide, it's humbling to think that we haven't actually come that far over the last 2,000 years. He had it right back 2,000 years ago. So I find that humbling. But thanks again, Bob, for all the preparation you put into this, and really outstanding presentation. Thank you.